welcome to this episode of the PS We Expire podcast. I'm Morgan, and I'm really glad that you're here. This week's episode is a conversation between myself and Rebecca Thomas, who is more than a life coach. Our conversation centered around what does it actually look like to live a life full of self-trust? What does it look like to have your life so pointed in the direction of what feels most aligned to you? What does that even look like? Rebecca shares her experience of working with clients, her personal experience, and some of the really, really hard things that have happened in her life that have brought so much profound clarity and direction to her life. So thank you for joining me for this episode. And I hope that the takeaways that you get from this just encourage you so much to embrace life on your own terms, that this helps bring you more confidence to be exactly who you are, so that you can make choices, that you can say yes to the things that you really want to say yes to and no to the things that don't actually align with you. I hope that this episode just bolsters your confidence in your own ability to be the co-creator and the director of your own life. So thank you for joining me. I'm so glad that you are here. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me on this episode today. I am really, really looking forward to having your wisdom just like ooze out of this episode and into the ears of the listeners. That sounded very like such a bizarre way to say that, but I know that you have so much life experience and so much professional experience that many of the things that we're going to talk about today are just going to be so helpful to so many people.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here and see where the conversation goes. And yeah, I can't wait to see what comes out.
So I want to talk first about one of the main things that you have on your website that says that not being able to trust yourself sucks. So can we just start our conversation talking about what exactly self-trust is and how this is like a long way to ask this question, but what self-trust is, how do we cultivate self-trust, and then what are the positive and negative outcomes of either not having self-trust or having self-trust? So I guess we can first talk about like what exactly self-trust is, because that is kind of like a very trendy thing to say with not very many people who are able to articulate what that actually is.
Yeah. So I think if we're going to talk about that, I want to start with talking about something I heard a couple of years ago, which has really built this framework for me being able to help my clients get from point A to point Z, when it comes to the self-trust piece. So I think we all know about boundaries, right? Everybody's been talking about that for a while now. But a lot of times we think about it like this is where I end and this is where you begin, or, this is my preference versus your preference. This is what I'm okay with versus what you're okay with. This is what I am and am not willing to tolerate. But I heard something about a year and a half ago, and she was talking about the fact that boundaries are all of those things, but more importantly, what allow us to keep us functioning in our integrity.
Hmm.
And so when I heard that, it really started to get my gears turning, because one of the things that I have been able to do and now help my clients do is to be able to understand how to show up as, and I also read something the other day, like not the best version of yourself, because that puts a lot like what is the best version of yourself, but like the most like what's the next best version of you? What is like how can you be more fulfilled or more happy or those things? So how do you show up as that version? And so a few years ago, more than a few years ago now, I really started to get curious about the fact of, what things was I okay with in my life? What things was I not okay with? And then really holding myself personally accountable for how I played into that dynamic. And then when I would recognize there were things that I was compromising about myself or didn't have an awareness of, I would start to sit with those things and start to understand like how they affect me. So like if I don't get a great night's sleep, what happens to me the next day or the next couple of days? Like, do I have physical pain? Do I have brain fog? Do I have trouble concentrating? Do I feel the need to want to snack more? Like, just to start to pay attention to those kinds of things. And so, really started to take that information and to start to build boundaries more with myself than with anybody else
Hmm.
around like what I would and wouldn't allow for myself, because that's what kept me in my integrity. And so when I really started to think about that and put that all together, it also helped me realize more recently that that is actually the thing that really helps us curate self-trust. Because at that point, because we're holding ourselves personally accountable, we're not putting it on somebody else or at the mercy of our own lives. We are actually the creator of our lives. And when I can trust myself, I don't really have to put as much time and energy and wondering or reacting to whether I can actually trust other circumstances or other people.
I am like feeling giddy. I'm feeling giddy about this distinction that you just made. And it's going to be difficult to articulate what I think is such a powerful shift about this idea of self boundaries, that
Mhm.
so many of the conversations about boundaries, like you said, have to do with like how I want other people to behave. And
Mhm.
really what we're saying when we say that is, I need you to act this way in order for me to feel the way that I want
Yep,
to feel. And if
absolutely.
we're shifting the conversation to self boundaries, we're directing the focus back towards the things that you actually have control over. And
Mhm.
some of this conversation is like, you know what? Yes, sometimes you don't have control over whether or not you get a good night's sleep. If you have little kids,
Mhm.
or if you have a puppy, or, you know, if there are other things happening in your life that interrupt your
Mhm.
sleep and you don't get a good night's sleep, that's fine. But the self boundaries come in where you start to recognize that about yourself, and you don't blame other people for, you know, like having a crappy day the next day. You know, you can
Mhm.
just acknowledge, okay, I didn't get a good night's sleep, and this is one of the results of that. But I love, 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 love this shift so much to self boundaries. So can you talk
Mhm.
more about like what practically what self boundaries look like? I mean, you already gave
Mhm.
one example of like getting a good night's sleep, but what are some other
Yeah.
examples of self boundaries that help build our self trust?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what area of your life you're talking about. I think that's another thing that's been a big realization for me recently is realizing like I have done so much work on myself and had so much personal growth. And in general, I have amazing self-trust and amazing grounded confidence, but to also recognize that we can have like pieces of our lives where we haven't applied that process to that specific area because we're either hung up there or just haven't got to a place of being able to grow in that area yet or haven't faced it, like whatever that looks like. So, for instance, back in the day, I did not date amazing men. I was
Mm.
in horrible, toxic relationships and got to a point where I decided that wasn't okay. Took a step back and went, okay, so what's the common denominator? Me. Okay, so what work are we going to do in order to shift that? Because I don't want to continue down the same path. I'm going to take ownership over that. And so it was funny because I actually did a ton of work in that realm as far as paying attention to how I showed up in the world, really, really addressing like my codependency and my neediness, which I did not. You like I had no awareness that those are the things that
Mm.
I was doing, let alone the dynamics I was in. So it was really peeling back the layers and starting to show up for myself, starting to set higher standards for myself and recognizing that, kind of that fear of abandonment or the people pleasing, like I need to compromise who I am just to make sure that somebody is here versus
Mm.
understanding who I am and then setting a really strong standard for how I will allow myself to be treated and how I expect to be treated. Um, but it was funny because through all that work, like that translated into everything else that I did. I mean, professionally, personally, it was just that self-value, the self-worth. It was the standards I was setting for myself and how people interacted with me and recognizing like what really was and wasn't okay just in a healthy way, like how people interact with you on a day-to-day basis. And I've done all that work, but it was funny because more recently, so I've been working on abundance mindset for years now. And I felt like I've done a ton of really amazing work, but there was still something that just wasn't clicking and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so a few months ago, I was really reflecting on like, what is the thing? I've got to figure it out. Like, I know
Mm.
I'm going to figure it out at some point. Like, what is the one cog that just needs to and just fit together and we'll have it. And so I really started sitting with that. And at one point realized the thing that was missing was I didn't trust myself with money. And so when
Mm.
I realized that, like there, you can have an abundance mindset, I think, and not trust yourself with money. Like they're two different things, but because that piece is still missing, like you're not setting the boundaries with yourself again to stay in your integrity financially. And once I realized that, I started to look back at all the other examples of things that I had done to build trust with myself in other areas, especially the relationship piece. And I was like, well, we've been here before. We know how to do this. We just apply it to the scenario instead. So,
I think that's a great way to look at it, where it's like, oh, I have the template now for what self-trust feels like, and can see outwardly the behavior that's a result of the internal
mhm.
work. And it's nice to know that you're not starting from zero, from
Yeah.
square one when you're trying to apply that to a different area of your life that comes into your conscious awareness. Because
Mhm.
I think one of the frustrating things about being on any kind of like personal development or spiritual path is like the work is never done. And it's like it can feel very frustrating and difficult at times to think, oh, look how far I've gotten, but look how much farther I have to go,
Oh
because the
man.
the more that you continue down this, the more things are going to come up that you have to face and deal with. And
Mhm.
that's just par for the course. Like, unless you want to move through life being numb to yourself, being disconnected from
Mhm.
yourself, like that is part of it. But what I appreciate about what you're saying is like, when something else comes up, you're not in the same mindset that you were when you first started.
Mhm.
It's like you have this awareness now of, okay, this is how I'm going to address this like bubbling up of distrust for myself in this other area. And that is such a relief to know that like the energy expended as we're quote unquote fixing
Yeah.
ourselves. It's not about fixing ourselves. It's about creating a life that is so in flow and in alignment with who we really are,
Mhm.
that we just want to continue to show up in that way. And I liked what you said at the very beginning about that having this idea of like our ideal self or our highest self
Mhm.
may not be the most helpful. It's like, what's the next best
Mhm.
thing? And I heard the other day this phrase, your happiest self. And I was
I
like,
think that's what I saw too that really got my wheels
I
turning.
love that
Yes.
so much, because then the pressure's off to be like your
Yes.
very best version of you. It's really like, what is the most fulfilled version of myself? What does that look
Mhm.
like? And if we don't develop an area of self trust in
Mhm.
tandem with asking this question about what makes me the most satisfied, then we end up not being satisfied because we're letting other people tell us what that looks like instead of letting
Yeah.
ourselves inform what a most
Yes.
satisfied life looks like. So for people who are like, as you were talking about dating and having
Mhm.
boundaries and self trust in dating, it seems
Mhm.
like that, not that it's easier, but that it may be less difficult to navigate new relationships
Mhm.
as you're discovering self-trust and boundaries, because then you can see it and say like, no, I don't want that. What about when you have people who are developing self-trust in relationships they've had for a long time, and
Mhm.
like how self-trust plays into being okay with setting boundaries and changing things in long-term relationships, whether that's familial with parents or
Mhm.
siblings or romantic or friendships?
I mean, I think, like, it's still I think, first of all, like, we always need to recognize that setting new boundaries is going to be a process regardless, and so having any kind of expectation around what that looks like outside of that it is going to be a process and it is your job to reinforce that boundary, like, everything else should go out the window because
Mm,
every scenario is gonna be different, every day is gonna be different, every person's gonna be different, and so I think that's the first thing to really do to set yourself up for success is to just get rid of any expectations around like
mm,
what it's going to look like and to really get clear with yourself around the why behind setting the boundary. Why am I setting the boundary? What does that boundary contribute to? How does that allow me to be happier and healthier? How does that allow me to love me and you at the same time? And to really understand that, because I think that allows us to set better boundaries versus, well, this we're just not doing this anymore. Because I think when we say things like that, it's easier to put up walls and it's easier to like disempower ourselves
mm,
because we're telling ourselves that something can't work versus having a conversation and communicating those things, which normalizes the emotion for everybody involved, but then also opens up those lines of communication. And you can invite people to communicate with you, but you can't force them to communicate with you. But in the same token, you're still putting in that effort, making it important for yourself, and then deciding what you're going to do with that if there's any pushback. So I
Mm.
think that's the biggest first thing, is just setting expectations, opening up the conversation. But the other thing that I love to talk about a lot too, which is so true. So have you heard of Newton's cradle?
No.
It's the table. Everybody know, like, as soon as I say that, everybody's like, nope. And then I talk about it and they're like, oh, I know where that is. But it's that tabletop game that has like the 5 balls that are suspended on it, and you
Oh,
pull one
sure.
back and it
Yeah.
swings down and pushes all the way to the other side. That's what setting boundaries is like. It's literally, you're the one that pulls up that first ball, you drop it. It's the most force that there's going to be. It swings all the way to the other side. So that's the person or the situation that you are setting the boundary with or having the conversation with. And then they push back, right? Like, that's natural. Most
Mm.
people aren't just like, oh, this is cool. Yeah, I love that boundary. Let's do this. They're like, whoa, 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 this is not how we've been doing this.
Mm.
This is uncomfortable. I don't like it. I want to go back to what feels familiar. So they push that boundary back, but then you push it back again. And every time there's a little less force. And so it
Mm.
keeps doing that until eventually it finds its new center. And I think that's the biggest thing to think about when we're setting boundaries, is it's a process. There shouldn't be any expectations, but then also knowing the why behind why we're setting the boundary and how that contributes to us showing up as the happiest version of ourselves.
How do you how do you figure out the why behind the boundaries? Because many people who are skeptical of like
Mhm.
self-improvement would say, "Oh, oh, you're just telling people like just only ever do what makes you happy or what feels good." And like
Mm,
on the
mhm,
inside of it, I know that that's not true, but it's
mhm,
difficult to help people understand the difference between like living my best life and only doing things that
mm.
feel good versus
Yeah.
what we're talking about where it's like deep
Yes.
authenticity and life satisfaction. So can you talk about the difference between like, the stereotypical like I want to be happy
Mhm.
all the time versus what deep self-trust actually is?
So it's interesting because those 2 things can actually get to very closely being the
Mm,
same thing after a lot of work. So I think that's first and foremost to note. But then also, wherever you're starting with that, when it comes to the boundaries, it's not that toxic positivity, right? It's not
mm,
that pushing down of feelings. It's not that denying how you feel or avoiding how you feel or numbing how you feel or gaslighting yourself, because, other people gaslighting us isn't enough. We've got to gaslight
mm,
ourselves too. So I think it takes putting yourself in spaces or accessing information that can help you understand what is and isn't healthy when it comes to interpersonal communication, dynamics, relationships, which Brene Brown has been tremendous to me in that area. Because even when you talk about that self trust piece, like, I can still remember exactly where I was. And I couldn't even tell you what book it was, but I remember I was reading one of her books and she was talking about the jar of marbles. Have you ever heard her talk about this?
please refresh my memory.
So it's where she was basically talking about how she was having a conversation with her very young daughter at the time, who was talking about trust. And somehow it turned into Brene having this epiphany that trust is not some big Herculean monumental thing that happens. It's the little tiny things that happen in and out of every single day or every single interaction with somebody. And so she was talking about like every single thing that somebody does to show up for us and show us that we
Uh,
can depend on us, that's a marble that gets put in the jar, but it only
mm,
takes one big act to actually dump the whole jar upside down.
mm,
Not just one big act though, because now that I think about that, that's literally the opposite of what she says. She says that you can slow like the somebody not showing up for us in those day-to-day ways, and there being resentment and anger and mistrust, like all those things are done by the tiny actions.
mm,
So I still remember where I was when I read this, and at the time it was in a dating situation, and all of a sudden I had this like the language, but also the validation of the things I was experiencing, and it was just, oh, like, it was mind-blowing for me, like,
mm.
that's what it is. There's nothing wrong with me. There's not something wrong with me for feeling the way I do. This is why I feel the way that I do. So I think definitely finding spaces to educate yourself on what is healthy and isn't healthy, just on a personal level, is instrumental in having the language and understanding that about yourself, and also normalizing what's healthy. So I think that's huge. Um, Gosh, there was something else I was gonna say. What did you ask me?
I don't remember.
Perfect.
I will go back a little bit to what you said about like how good we are at gaslighting ourselves. And
Mm,
I want to pause there for a moment because typically with like very used phrases, we
mhm,
end up using them and not understanding what they mean.
mhm.
So, could you give a really practical example of what gaslighting ourselves actually looks like? Because if we're going to have a conversation about building up self-trust, we have to
Yeah,
say like this is exactly what the barriers are to us being
mhm.
able to do that. So what
Yeah,
exactly is gaslighting ourselves?
I mean, the biggest piece, there's a couple different things. Part of it is, like, telling ourselves that how we feel is right or wrong. Like,
Hmm.
that's gaslighting ourselves. How we feel is just how we feel. Assigning a right or wrong, good or bad is the thing that actually gets us in trouble and gets us trapped into that mind spiral of shame and guilt and victimhood and all of those things. But I think when we can start to understand, like, regardless of those things, like, this is how I feel right now, and sitting with it, but then starting to uncover, like, why do I feel like this? What's causing me to feel like this? Is there something that I can change that will keep me from feeling like this in the future, or something that I can do to support myself while I feel like this? And just let yourself move through that thing versus, again, right or wrong, good or bad, because it's not right or wrong, good or bad. It's how you feel, period.
Hmm.
Um, but then also going to that, like, comparison is a big thing that comes up when it comes to gaslighting ourselves. Like, I shouldn't feel this way because so
Hmm.
and so has it worse. Again, that's not your experience. You're experiencing what you feel right now, and regardless of that, like, you just feel how you feel. So why are you trying to compare it to something else and justify how you feel based on somebody else's experience? Like, it's so layered. You can't do that and expect to have a very good outcome for you in the end, especially if you do that over and over and over and over.
Hmm. I like the making a differentiation between good and bad feelings, because I
Mhm.
think many of us are taught, many women particularly are taught
Mhm.
things like anger are bad.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the problem becomes if we don't allow ourselves to feel it and express it in healthy ways, it just gets stored in our bodies and ends up,
Mhm.
creating um creating real problems for us later, especially like
Dis-ease.
yes, yeah, and
Mhm.
as we're talking about creating a life that is where the deep alignment
Mhm.
and the true happiness get closer and closer,
Mhm.
part of being able to do that is allowing ourselves to feel everything that we feel
Yeah.
in a way to inform us of areas that still need attention.
Well, and the other piece of that too is everything that you said, and anger is one side of a two-sided coin. So as much as you will allow yourself to feel those heavier, more challenging emotions is how much you will actually allow yourself to feel the brighter, lighter joy,
Mm,
happiness, all of those things without waiting for the other shoe to drop.
mm,
So you can't go all the way in on one and not go all the way in on other, but if you diminish any of that, that's how much you're diminishing the other side of the coin.
mm. But I don't wanna feel the hard things.
Well,
I know
why?
I speak for everybody. Well, because the truth is like it doesn't feel good in my body. Like my stomach hurts or it's making my
Right.
throat tighten up or whatever. And it really is a skill that many of us are not taught as children how to
Oh, for sure.
just sit with what it feels
Oh,
like. I
yeah.
had I had an experience with my daughter who's, a preteen the other day.
Mhm,
She was really upset about something and I just asked her, "Okay, where are you feeling that in your
mhm,
body?"
mhm,
And I'm offering her, "Are you feeling it in your stomach or your throat?" And she's responding yes or no and I'm asking, "What exactly does it feel like? Is it hot?
mhm.
Does it feel like a stabbing pain or like a throbbing pain?"
Yeah.
And I feel like I can only do that with her because I'm learning how to do that with myself. I'm learning
Mm.
how to, when the feelings come up, to
Recognize it and acknowledge it.
and suspend my
Mhm.
judgment for, like
Mhm.
exactly what you said. If we're gaslighting ourselves, we're feeling what comes up and we're saying, oh, I shouldn't feel that, or that's bad, or,
Uh-huh.
instead of being like, just what does this actually feel like? And where am I feeling
Yeah.
this in my body? That is how we process emotions instead of stuffing them. And that is what enables us to face everything that comes up when we're like, okay, there's nothing I'm going to run away from.
Yeah.
I'm going to be here for all of it.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things here. So when you were talking about like how it's not normalized and how especially with kids like we want to protect them, right? From those hard
Mm,
feelings, but I ended up reading this article years ago and I still have it. I saved it to my Pinterest board that talks about it, but it applies to everybody. It was talking about how not allowing our kids to feel their feelings was the very thing that was keeping them from being able to process and understand and have deeper
uh,
awareness because we're constantly going in and trying to make it better and trying to fix it for them versus letting them build
mm,
resilience and awareness around what it was they were feeling in order to move through it. Which, guess what? Then we do that and then we turn into adults who are doing the same things. But
mm.
then when you were talking about the fact that, like we don't want to feel those things, if I were sitting with a client and they said that, which believe me, this has happened many, many, many times. Oh, okay. So you're just not going to feel that feeling because it's so uncomfortable. But by not feeling that feeling, what happens? Like you said before, it just gets stored in your body,
Right.
which means it multiplies, which means it
Yes.
just comes up again versus if we actually sit with it and let it be uncomfortable. Like I always say, it's hard until it's not.
Mm,
Because at some point you actually get to the point, as uncomfortable as it can be, to sit with your feelings and to have that awareness and to be able to acknowledge them and validate them and move through them without having to fix them, that you can actually process them faster
mm.
and get on the other side of it and not have this big, huge thing that just like throws everything in your life off track because it's a feeling that you're moving through. It's not something that like a does a oh my gosh, what's the word? Destination that you're actually
Mm.
arriving at, but you're actually feeling through it.
Yeah, I have found in my own experience that the more that I resist something, the bigger it
Mhm.
gets,
Yeah.
and the thing that has been most helpful to me as I moved through some really hard things is reminding myself that it's all temporary. This is
Mhm.
gonna pass. How I
Yeah.
even as terrible as I feel right now, if my anxiety is
Mhm.
like maxed out, I'm at a 10.
Yeah.
I know because I've been here before. I know it's at some point that
Mhm.
10 is going to come down to 9, is going to come down to 4, is going to come down to 0. So
Yeah.
reminding myself in those moments, like, okay, like this is
Yeah.
temporary. It's okay.
Well,
And that's, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say the other thing there too, going back to that boundaries piece is when we start to get really curious and we start to build that awareness of things that make us uncomfortable or something that comes up for us a lot. So for instance, anxiety. What causes me to be anxious? What does that feel like? What does that look like? How does it affect me? How do I show up when I'm feeling anxious? If you can do that work while you're not feeling incredibly
Mm,
anxious, then you can get to a point when you'll start to notice the symptoms versus being in full blown anxiety, but then also know how to care for yourself and be able to navigate that without letting it take everything over too. And that applies to anything else.
mm. Isn't it just so much easier though to just like completely numb myself out to my life?
I
I
mean,
don't I'm saying this like as a rhetorical question that like
you're
this
right.
this is the this is the illusion of
Mhm.
what life can look like. This is what we are sold. This is
Oh,
what we
for
fall
sure.
for, hook, line, and sinker is
Chase the
like
next thing.
just,
Uh-huh.
yes, chase the next thing, which is different than whatever you're feeling right now. Like
Mhm.
I promise you'll feel better if you just have this and this and this instead of actually
Yeah.
feeling what you're feeling in those moments.
Oh, for sure.
So
Yeah.
with building self-trust, and as we're
Mhm.
talking about the difference between like feeling our emotions and storing our emotions, like what does self trust feel like? Maybe just from your own personal experience and maybe from your clients as well. What
Yeah.
how can you tell the difference in your body, I guess, between something that is like self trust versus, what am I trying to ask here?
Oh, I can already respond.
Okay, good. You're catching the gist of what I'm
Yeah.
asking.
Well, and also it's come up so much and also been something that I worked on that. So with that self-trust piece, so I talked about how staying in your integrity and building boundaries that way, especially with yourself, is the thing that actually builds self-trust, because then you can trust yourself to make the right decisions for you versus being at the mercy of everything else around you. Um, so when you ask what self-trust feels like, on the other side of that, because I actually built a framework for this in my coaching, it's boundaries that keep you in your integrity, build self-trust, which leads to grounded confidence, which leads to authenticity. So when
Mm,
you talk about that self-trust piece, you start empowering yourself enough to know that you can trust yourself. So I think part of that is it feels on the other side of that like confidence. It feels like not overthinking. It feels like not reacting to a lot of things, which I think before you build that trust with yourself in an area, any area or in all areas, like we can feel again like we're at the mercy of something, or like what happens with me is contingent on A, B, and C out
mm,
there versus what I choose to do about it in here. And so I think it feels like this self-assuredness, this ease, this peace, this it's not chaotic. It's not um something we have to deal with right now. It's I can sit with it and it's going to be okay, and I know that I'm going to figure it out. And if not, in the meantime, that's okay too. So there's not this urgency and there's not this reactive dynamic to
mm.
make it better or change it right now.
So if someone is feeling a sense of urgency and they are
Mhm.
working really hard to develop self-trust,
Mhm.
is that is that a time to be able to exercise like what exactly am I feeling in my body in this moment? Because
Oh, for sure.
urgency feels like get me out of here.
Mhm.
Like
Well, and it also feels like get me out of here, but also like it's crisis, right? I'm in crisis, I'm in crisis, I'm in crisis. And that just keeps you in survival mode. So I think another thing that's really important around all of this is also, we were talking before about how making sure that you are surrounding yourself with information that can help you better understand and know
Mm,
what's healthy and those kinds of things. The other thing that's really important in all of these things is not only that you're supporting yourself, but that you also have people in your circle, even if you don't literally know them, kind of like you and
mm,
I. You and I have never met in person, but having spaces you can plug into that can also, again, like validate your experience, but also remind you, like, I've been through it too. You can get on the other side, be able to cheerlead you and support you without commiserating. Or one of the other things I talk about, like the woundology, the social currency, how we use trauma as social currency. So, not spiraling
uh,
into the thing that's actually happening, but having a space where you can put it down, move through it, and then pick it back up when you're ready, but not that commiseration.
hmm. That I have never heard that phrase before, but that is really piquing my interest. The trauma as social currency.
That's Carolyn Mace, MYSS. She's one of my favorite educators, and woundology is one of the things that she talks about that just it's funny. I was doing another podcast recently, and we ended up talking about that, and she had never heard that either. And it's so funny because I know in a lot of circles here. So I'm in the greater Grand Rapids area in Michigan, and I have a friend where we were having different events. I co-own an events company. She was doing some kind of private events off of a Facebook group, and we got together and we're kind of talking about like why the dynamic and the energy was so different.
Mm.
And the very next day I sat down to an email that Carolyn Mason sent out, and in there was the information about woundology. And as soon as I heard her describe that, like the use of trauma as social currency, I was like that's the thing. That's exactly what's happening here. And I don't it's not, again, it's not right or wrong, good or bad. It's again that Newton's cradle where it's something that we're normalizing right now. So we're normalizing the language, we're normalizing talking about it. Is that the way it's being used right now? More than not, absolutely. But that's actually what's going to allow us to open the door to get on the other side of that, where we're
Hmm.
not using it so much as currency, but it's normalized and we can be on the other side of that.
Hmm. So I see, I mean, what that sounds like is that people talking about their trauma
Mhm.
is helpful in the sense of that means people are talking about their trauma,
Yes,
but
yes,
the potential negative byproduct of that is then that's where we get stuck. Because
yes.
if we're thinking about it in the same way that we think about emotions that we
Mhm,
suppress but give attention to somehow, or like
mhm.
try to avoid,
Yeah.
that just because we're talking about our trauma doesn't necessarily mean that we're healing it.
Right, because sometimes, like, when we talk about it in this way, it's like comparing wounds, right?
Mm,
Like, that and also using it as a way to define ourselves. Well, there's a difference between defining yourself and defining your trauma because the defining your trauma actually gives you information to understand where you are and what you're dealing with, which then allows you to understand how you can get on the other side of it versus
mm.
this is what I am.
I have had to work through this so much in regards to my oldest daughter, Annie, who had a genetic disease.
Mhm.
And seeing myself as like a special needs parent or having a
Mhm.
child with a terminal diagnosis,
Mhm.
I, for a long time, was so resistant to giving up that identity. And
Mm.
I want to tread very gingerly here because I
Yeah.
recognize, firsthand experience how difficult and traumatizing it is to have that experience with your child.
Mhm.
But what was a really powerful and important shift for me was when I realized that if I was trying to like garner attention from other people by
Mm.
pushing the pity button,
Mhm.
that only continued to perpetuate the belief that I was alone.
Yeah.
And it's in the processing of our trauma, it's in the processing of our hard things, it's in allowing however we feel about those, and that I can see that part of myself that wanted that belonging and validation from other people to say,
Mhm.
"Oh my god, like you're working so hard, you're
Mhm.
doing such a good job."
Mhm.
All of us want that so desperately, but
Yeah, yeah.
the difference in how that feels in my body, I don't need to
Mhm.
have any like judgment or shame around recognizing that part of myself that just wanted to be
Mhm.
seen and validated by other people. But it's a different kind of energy when you move into a place of stop pushing the pity button, being
Yeah.
like, look at how hard I've got it, into
Right.
we're all in this human soup together. And I know that just because my circumstances may be a little bit more unique because of what I'm going through with my daughter doesn't mean that you haven't also felt
Mhm.
helpless at a diagnosis, or that you haven't also felt the depths of grief at the
Mhm.
life that you thought you would have that you don't have. So these emotions are common to all of us. And that
Mhm.
if we get so fixated and identified with whatever the hard thing that we're in, that
Mhm.
creates barriers to connection with other people.
Yeah. And I think that's another reason why talking about any of this is so important because we can get stuck in this inner dialogue and these inner feelings of like the guilt and the shame
Mm,
and the pity. And that just keeps us stuck because again, it's defining ourselves. I am this thing. There must be something wrong with me because this is how I'm navigating it. But when we start to talk about it with other people, not only does that allow us to be supported and let them provide value to us versus trying to do it ourselves, but it also shows other people what we're experiencing, in which case most people will, like you were saying, also be able to say like this is also something I've experienced, even if it's not in the same way, but being able to relate and validate and express like that similarity between us. Um yeah, I think that's so incredibly beautiful and it's also super important for removing the stigma from so many different things
mm.
too.
What just came up for me was how beautiful self trust is in this area of validation. So I
Mhm.
think many of us don't lean into self trust because we're so used to other people giving us the feedback on whether or not what we're doing is right or wrong. And this is like,
Mhm.
this is straight out of
Oh,
how
it's
we
rampant
were.
in our society.
Right? And
Yeah.
it makes so much sense because that is what we had to do as children. That
Yeah.
is what signaled to us whether or not we were going to survive, is that
Yeah.
belonging.
Yeah.
And as we shift into adulthood and we learn how to apply all of these new skills of, feeling what you're feeling and non-judgment to
Mm-hmm.
your experience, we rely less and less on other people to tell us whether or not we belong, and we start to just know it. We just
Mm-hmm.
know that we belong, because it's okay if I don't belong to everyone, at least I belong to myself.
That part. Yes. I think so. Brene Brown have you ever heard of her midlife unraveling?
Oh yes, she talks about that instead of like that it's
Oh
a midlife
yeah.
crisis. It's
Yes, it's
yes,
midlife
it's
and like everything
powerful.
you're saying right now reminds me of that. And I literally have her quote on my website because it's so true. It talks about like, how we get to the point where our days are shorter and the coping
Mm,
mechanisms just are not working for us anymore. And it's time to shake them off
mm,
and just start being seen. And all of that's so true. But it is so hard because there are so many people. Like, I think one of the reasons that feeling our feelings is so hard is because other people are not comfortable with how we feel.
ah,
Not because we're not comfortable with it, but because they're not comfortable with it. So that brings to mind another thing. Have you ever heard of the drama triangle?
no.
Okay, so that is
I'm learning so many things today. This is so exciting.
so the drama triangle talks about, and this is a huge piece of that, not willing to feel comfortable with other people's discomfort. So it's this triangle, and at one top corner is the savior, at the other top is the persecutor, and at the bottom is the victim. And the problem
Hmm.
is like the persecutor is constantly telling the victim, like, you're not good enough, you can't do this, da da da. The savior is, oh, it's okay, I'll fix it for you, and is basically the enabler too.
Hmm.
So the victim doesn't feel empowered because it's being fed this story that you're not good enough, you can't fix it. So they start to believe it and internalize it. But then the savior at the same time is showing them, like, well, you can't fix it. You don't have the tools.
Hmm.
But all of that just keeps them in the same cycle of victimhood. So when you flip that upside down, it actually turns into the empowerment dynamic where the victim becomes the creator and the savior becomes the coach and the persecutor becomes the challenger. And so
Hmm.
all of a sudden that person is actually the one that's co-creating everything, but it's being supported by those other roles. The challenger is, you know, challenging them to do better and reassuring them, but pushing them more. And then the coach is, asking reflective questions and how can I support you? How are you going to But
Hmm.
that still puts all of the power back into the creator. So that's one of my favorite things to talk about with that piece, because I think so often with that saviorism, it's let me fix it for you because I
Hmm.
don't want to feel uncomfortable. But that's exactly, like I said, what robs us of being able to feel comfortable. Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, this isn't okay. I mean, we couldn't tell you most of the time why it's not okay. It's just something that we
Hmm.
learn because of that whole dynamic.
That is even just going back to like really practically what that looks like in a parenting situation.
Mm-hmm.
Is like if my kids, like you said, like if we are going through life like protecting our kids from,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
what we're doing essentially is creating adults who don't know how to process everything that they're feeling.
Or they're scared to fail forward. Weird.
Yes. Yeah. What
Do
a
we know anybody
surprise.
like that?
Yeah. And I think it's like, it's not a call for parents to be like neglectful or to like
No.
put unrealistic expectations or barriers in their children's lives,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
it's really a call for them to learn how to manage their own emotions so that they
Mm-hmm.
can be there for their kids as they're processing their emotions. And that is how we create self-aware,
Yeah.
contributing members of society that are not stuck in that cycle of the victimhood.
Mm-hmm.
When you flip that triangle and
Mm-hmm.
on top is the creator, I got like
Yeah.
head to toe chills, because that to me is like, that is what being fully human really is. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is being the creator in your life,
Yeah.
creating the type of life that you want, and then using those other dynamics to be able to just
Mm-hmm.
continue to push you into more self-trust, which in turns ends up having this life that you don't feel like you need to run away from, but this life that you are like fully immersed in. And not that it's like
Absolutely.
perfect all the time, but
You
what
trust yourself to get through it.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
That's exactly right. So
I agree.
where do people start when they're,
I mean, where they are?
uh,
What do you mean?
yes, that's a good question. I can see myself like having this tendency to be like, give me 1, 2, 3 steps to fix it, and then I'll never have to deal with this
Yeah,
again. I
no.
think that's like so normal for us to do that.
Yeah, we want
Um,
that certainty and that very structured, like, this is what it looks like, and it's actually the exact opposite that's gonna get you closer
mm,
to, yeah, everything else that's way better.
hmm.
What were you gonna say, though?
So I was going to ask for people that maybe are in that spot where like the coping mechanisms aren't working anymore, like as we were talking
Mm,
about
mhm,
Brene Brown's midlife unraveling, when we're
uh-huh,
in that spot where our coping stuff isn't working anymore, and we are maybe just about ready to make some big changes.
mhm.
What next?
I mean, it depends. I think first thing is less judgment and more curiosity
Hmm.
and more self-compassion. So going back to that again, it's not right or wrong, good or bad. It is recognizing this is how I feel and starting to dig into the layers of why you feel that way and what perpetuates you feeling that way and what empowers you to not feel that way. Um, Finding language. So Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart is
Hmm.
again mind blowing just because one of the things she says in there, and I think she has 87 feelings and emotions that are in that
Hmm.
book. And I remember, so I've listened to the book and I've read the book, and when I was listening to it, I remember her saying, like, they did a poll, and I mean, she's got a huge following, so I can't even imagine how many people participated in this, but on average, adults could only name 3 feelings,
Hmm.
and it was, like, happy, sad, angry, or something
Those are
like
the
that.
exact three that
Yeah.
just came to mind for me. Yep.
Yeah.
Happy, sad, mad.
And s yeah, and so starting to, okay, I don't know what this feeling is. Friends, we've all got Google.
Hmm.
So, like, look it up. What does this feel like? But then not take everything with a grain of salt, or instead of that, take everything with a grain of you.
Hmm.
So, even though there might be a definition or something that comes up, you can still pick and choose pieces of things that make sense, or maybe feel like they apply, or maybe they don't apply, and start to put those things together and start to better understand yourself. And when you can better understand yourself, not only can you better validate yourself, but then you can also better communicate with yourself and other people around how you feel, what you need, what needs to be different. And that's key to shifting almost everything, I think, is being able to communicate those things, but then also validate them for yourself.
Hmm. That is a difficult thing to be able to communicate to other people when you don't have
Mhm.
the words for it. So I think that's a
Well, and it's
really
uncomfortable talking about too, right? Like,
very, yeah,
so you're probably
yeah,
gonna have to do it a little bit scared.
yes. So I mean, that's two really practical pieces of advice. Is one, to expand your emotional vocabulary so that you
Mhm.
have more words that can communicate effectively how you really feel. And then also understanding that, yeah, it's not going to feel very good at first. Just
Mhm.
like any new skill that we're acquiring, we're probably going to
Mhm.
be pretty crappy at it out of the gate.
Yeah.
But the more that you do it, the better you get at it. And not that it maybe necessarily feels better, but that
Mhm.
that on the other side of that feeling, you're okay. And
Well,
on
and
the
then on
other
top of
side of the hard conversation, you're okay still.
yes, and I think the other piece too is not only you beginning to build self-trust with yourself, but then you can also build more trust with other people, not only because you feel empowered to take care of yourself and your needs, but also because everything that you're doing is leading by example, which means there's
Mm,
this ripple effect to your healing and your growth and your understanding and your awareness and all of those things. So that's, and I've seen it in my, like, oh my gosh, I look at the things that I've done and like the permission that
mm,
it's granted to other people that's just had this ripple effect of how they show up and how they communicate about things. Hurt people and heal people. So it's just
mm,
everybody's at their own stage of whatever it is they're experiencing. But when you're leading by example, there's no agenda. I'm doing it for myself, but that's just permission for other people to do the same thing. So when you're inviting them on this journey with you, um, but then also allowing them to show up for you and not telling yourself the story that our dynamic, our relationship is contingent on it not
mm,
being uncomfortable.
mm. Yeah. I wonder how many times we blow up our relationships because we feel like they should feel good all the time.
I feel like a
Like
lot.
this should be easy. This should be way
Yeah,
easier.
right? Yeah. Oh, this is the universe telling me no.
Right. Well, and I could see
Mm.
how, like, for someone who is caught in that dynamic of the upside down triangle, that
Mhm.
there probably are relationships that are not healthy.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I realize, like, in the flipping of that triangle,
Mhm.
sometimes it might be the exact same people, but because of where you're
Mhm.
at, you hear it differently.
Yes.
Because our
And
brains are very good at focusing on whatever we tell it to focus on. So if I'm
mhm.
focusing on, like, this person is always saying blah 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 to me, I will find evidence to support that belief. And
Yeah.
so much of it is that internal shift of, like, okay, I am
Yes.
a creator in my life, I'm a co-creator in my life, and I'm going to choose what to pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think the biggest part of all of that is just recognizing how much power you have over that, and not power as in, I need to dominate all, but I am not at the mercy of. I still get to decide, just like I was saying,
Mm.
take it with a grain of salt. No, take it with a grain of you, because you are still a part of this and you get to have a say in how much other people say or influence. It's still up to you.
Hmm. And that's like, yeah, keep checking in. Keep checking in
Mhm,
with yourself.
always. I mean, we're scanning anyway, so we might as well use
Yeah.
it for our
Yeah.
our benefit.
Yeah. How did you personally come to this work?
So that's a really interesting and one of my favorite stories. When I was younger, I went through a lot of things, and not just when I was younger, but in my teens and my 20s was in survival mode like no other, had no like aspirations or goals, was
Mhm.
just merely like moving from day to day at the mercy of my life. And when I had my son, I was late 20s and really started to sit with, is this what I want his life to look like? Not
Hmm.
only who I am, but also what I teach him is normal, for a single mother, for a son, for a man, for a woman. And I started to sit with all those things. And that's when the curiosity really started for me. And then, right about the time I turned 30, it got to the point where I was starting to have these brave conversations and saying these things out loud. Before, it
Mm.
was a lot that was going on in my mind, but when I was turning 30, I really started having those conversations, mainly with my son's father, about like what our relationship was and what I wanted my future to look like and his involvement in that. And he basically told me, I can't do that for you. And so I think that was one of the first times I really recognized, when we talk about gaslighting ourselves, people tell us the truth way more often than we're willing to
Huh.
admit, and we don't wanna hear it. But I think
Ah.
that was one of the first times where I heard it and I was like, "He this is his truth and it is the truth." So I sat with that and started to really reflect on, again, what I wanted my future to look like. Still took some time, but a couple of years after that, broke up with him. um, there was a real interesting period of my life. So after I broke up with him, I took some time off from dating because that was the point where I realized I was the common denominator. I was the one making my relationship decisions. And so we needed to do some work there. So I ended up finding somebody online who I just fell in love with their material and just soaked it all in. And that was the thing that really started to change my self worth and my self value. But funny enough, that trickled into all areas of my life. And so once I did that, started dating again, and then met somebody who I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. So to back up a little bit from that, in the meantime, my brother, younger brother, had also gotten in a car accident, became a quadriplegic, and I was
Oh.
actually helping him for several years, helped him with like home remodels or managing his caregivers. I would go over and see him once a week. And so he ended up passing away 10 years ago and left me his house. And all of this ties together, I promise.
Mm.
But he left me his house. So my son and I ended up moving to the Grand Rapids area, which is an hour from where we'd been for most of my son's life at that point. Moved there, was still seeing the man that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. And then exactly 1 year later to that day that my brother passed away, the man I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with ended up passing away suddenly.
Oh
So
my
when we
God.
talk about like feeling the feelings and sitting with your discomfort, like that was the season that forced me to do that. I
Mm.
mean, and grieve in completely separate ways, but also really sit with my discomfort, but grieve for myself versus how other people thought I should grieve, because that's a real thing here too.
Yes. Yeah.
And so through that, that's one of the things that really helped me feel my feelings. That's a big thing that I talk with a
Mhm.
lot of my clients about, is feeling your feelings. And so after we moved and after those 2 losses, I ended up being a work from home salary position, was a single mom, was trying to figure out how to supplement my income, and I ended up stumbling on Airbnb. And when I saw that, I was like, "Oh, I can do this." So we actually started hosting people in our house. We didn't have a separate residence that they went and stayed at. They actually stayed in our home, and everything was shared outside of
Mm.
from the bedroom that they stayed in. And so it was through these interactions with all these random strangers in our home, and then also doing some personal development at the same time and hearing the term life coach, that everything just magically, I was like, that's it. That's the thing. That's what I'm supposed to do. So that's the short story of
Mm.
how I started doing what I do. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's many people don't make changes until staying the same is too painful.
Mhm.
And
I've been there
I
too.
think, and I think many people have experiences like this where they lose someone that they love, or,
Mhm.
life shifts in a big way that they weren't anticipating, that
Mhm.
it's enough to like shake the snow globe,
Yeah.
and start to ask the questions that weren't required of us to
Mhm.
really investigate before that. And we can get by numbing the emotions that come with like smaller events. And that's
Mhm.
not to say to like minimize like how hard things are, but like when something really big happens like that, where it's like the
Mhm.
emotions refuse to be ignored, then
Yeah.
that's, I think, for many people, when they start to be like, okay, I need more tools here. I need to know how to still show up in
Mhm.
my life when this is what life is going to look like.
Yeah, and I think another piece of that too is it's really easy to tell ourselves, like, "This is just who I am now. Like, this is just the pain that I'm going to
Mm,
have," and to
mm,
continue to carry that weight through the rest of their lives, and I think that's another hard thing that I've watched before. I'm incredibly grateful that wasn't what I did with mine, but I've seen that too, and I think that's where we can really get caught up, whether it's a huge loss or a season of grief like this, or whether it's something completely different. I think it's really easy to acclimate to the pain
mm.
and just tell ourselves like, "Well, this is just who I am now. This is just how I feel."
And then when we have a culture that perpetuates the trauma as
Yeah.
social currency,
Yeah.
it it hinges on us
Yeah.
making that part of ourselves.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, there's an Instagram I follow, and it's not about emotional and spiritual pain, it's about physical pain, but
mm.
I think about the name of it all the time, "Stop Chasing Pain."
Huh.
So, yeah.
The interesting thing about that is like the emotional pain is physical pain,
Mhm,
right? Because,
absolutely.
well, and
Yeah.
that's an interesting, I don't think I've really thought about it like that until just now. That because emotions don't exist like somewhere out
Right.
here, they exist
Right.
as energy in our bodies that's moving and
Yeah.
causing, tightening and clenching or
Yeah.
pain or whatever. And so that's a really interesting way to think about, like, maybe I shouldn't even use like the term addiction, but more like how much our brains are wired for familiarity, that
Mhm.
when something is familiar, even if it's awful,
Mhm.
we like that
We
on some level
tend to
because
that,
it's
yeah.
that's what's comfortable for us, is what's familiar. And so
Yeah.
I can see how easy it would be to just settle into this, like, well, this feels really terrible, but at least I know what this feels like,
Mhm.
to what would that mean for me to heal?
Mhm.
What's on the other side of me not feeling like this anymore? And that, I think, is what is really scary to people. Is
Oh,
like,
for
if I
sure,
if I give this
especially
up, what do I have left?
yeah, especially when you talk about the fact that for a majority of us and our experiences, it's very similar to things that our family and close friend circles
Mm,
have experienced too. So then how dare you be
right.
the person, the transitional character who decides it's going to be different for you, and all of a sudden you start playing with a different set of rules, and we're all hurting and coping in the same way. Like that's really hard too, because again, human nature, like we want to get back to that ground zero, right? This is how
Mm,
we've done it. This is what that looks like. This is what's familiar. But it's that fear of, if somebody's doing it differently, I think subconsciously, whether consciously or not, but subconsciously, all of a sudden, we understand that we could do it differently too. And
ah,
that's
right.
threatening. That's super scary. So,
Mm,
so I think
yeah.
that's another reason, going back to what we were talking about before, why surrounding yourself with people that are supportive, that aren't going to try to get you back to ground zero and will encourage you and support, even if they don't understand it. Like one of the best phrases I've ever used in my life that I share with my clients all the time too is, I don't need you to understand, I need you to trust. Like going back
Mm,
to that trust piece, because it's hard to trust yourself and it's hard for other people to trust anything, the unknown, right? I don't know what this looks like. I can't explain it to you. I just know this is what I need to do, but I need you to trust me because I'm working on trusting me.
hmm. That's a really beautiful ask. I need
Yeah.
you to trust me as I'm learning to trust me.
And it puts everything on the table too, because it's saying, I don't have the answers. I can't, like,
Mm,
I can't explain it to you. There's no 1, 2, 3 step. There's just, I've got to figure it out, and I'm willing to mess it up a little bit doing that. Will
mm.
you come with me?
Yeah, it's very helpful to have that understanding and perspective of like when people are trying to keep you from growing in
Mm-hmm.
any particular ways. It's so helpful to remember what you just said about like if someone sees you doing it, that means that they can do it too, and that is very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's very confronting to their own
Mm-hmm.
choices and their own beliefs about what they think is possible. And so it makes sense that they would project that onto you, but being
Mm-hmm.
able to recognize it as a projection of their own
Yeah.
fear or self-judgment or shame or guilt
Yeah.
or whatever about what their life looks like, that helps so much to free ourselves up from being tied to the validation of other people, where we can
Mm-hmm.
say like, oh, actually this doesn't really have that much to do
Have
with
anything
me.
to do with me. Yeah, exactly.
Because
And I
all
think
of
the
us are in
other,
the same boat of only thinking about ourselves more than we
well,
think about
because who
everybody
are we
else.
with 24/7? Ourselves, right? So that it's
Yes.
hard not to think that way. But I think the other thing that's really key there too, and also very freeing, is the people that are trying to bring you back to ground zero. Like, it's most of the time it's not malicious. Not to say that
Mm,
it's never malicious, but most of the time it's not. It's, again, it's just that human tendency, that like, get back to ground zero, not anything to do with you, but also that's also so freeing too, because you're allowed to build that trust with yourself, create trust between the two of you, build that grounded confidence, but then live more authentically, passing that permission to other people. And that's the most beautiful thing you could do. I'm going to go
mm,
here first. I'm going to lead. And the only thing that means is I go first. That's it. Literally, not that I know what I'm doing or have the answers, but I'm going to go first, and I'm going to show you that it's okay. And maybe you'll come along, or maybe you'll just sit here and not judge me and over criticize and all the other
mm.
things that could try to pull me back down.
Yeah. I will say a little tangent to what
Hmm.
you just said about recognizing that for the most part people aren't doing that maliciously.
Hmm.
I think many of us can stay in situations that are no longer
Mm.
healthy for us because we know that and empathize with that
Mhm.
in other people. And I just want to say, like, it's okay for you to understand that the other person is doing it from a problem or from a perspective of
Mhm.
pain or that it doesn't have much to do with you, and that
And
it's still okay for you to not continue to be in that relationship in the same way with that person. So I think
yeah.
about many people who don't have relationships with their parents, adults who
Mhm.
don't have relationship with their parents
Yeah.
or have very limited and very boundaried relationships with their
Mhm.
parents. And that can still come with the understanding that they're not, hurting you on purpose.
Yeah.
They're not saying those things on purpose. But I just wanted to throw that out
Oh,
there,
yeah,
that
that's important.
living from a place of empathy and understanding and
Doesn't mean you
self-awareness. Yes.
compromise yourself.
Yes.
Correct. Yes. And I
Yeah.
think family, especially close family, including parents, are like probably one of the most challenging dynamics to
Mm,
navigate because there's so much like guilt and obligation and all for one, one for all type of approach versus that understanding around I'm an individual and I know and trust, or I'm learning to know and trust what's okay for me. And that doesn't mean that there's no love or we can't get to the other
mm,
side of this. But I think it just really feels threatening a lot, especially with parents and older generations.
mm. I suspect, I hope not, but I suspect that, as my children become adults and they start to
Mhm.
talk to me about the ways that I failed them as a mother,
Oh,
I'll have
yeah.
to go through my next evolution of self-awareness and, and
Yeah,
and
been
validating
there.
them. And that's,
I've
that's
been
okay. It's
there.
just par for the course.
Yeah.
I think that the thing that we can probably finish on is you brought up self-worth.
Mhm.
And I really believe that self-worth is a key to all of this.
Mhm.
And as we start to pay attention to the thoughts that we have, the feelings that we have, um,
Mhm.
it's really helpful that anytime we have that internal narrative of that we're not worth it, we're not worthy,
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
can trust that that's not our voice. That came from somebody else. That doesn't
Yeah.
actually, it's not generated from the deepest parts of you.
No. That's something we've learned to cope around along the way, or that somebody else led by example. But the thing I talk about a lot there too is like we deserve simply for being. So
Mm,
trying to prove our worth is not a thing. I think acceptance is the most beautiful thing you can do for yourself, is just completely accepting yourself and starting to understand yourself. But then for those of us that still have trouble doing that for ourselves, the thing that I refer to a lot is, and something that I say is, be kind to my friend. And I
mm,
say that because when we are still struggling to show up for ourselves and to do it for ourselves and we're not quite there, it still puts in motion those things of caring for and acknowledging and loving ourselves, even if we're doing it for someone else.
mm,
But then also thinking about the example that we're setting again. So even if I am struggling with feeling worthy or things like that, if I have kids or nieces and nephews or my mom or an aunt or really close friends, what's the message that I want to send to them? And
mm.
how do I embody that? Because do as I say and not as I do never works. So how do I embody them? And again, be the leader, go first. And so that motivator might be something external, but eventually that's the thing that actually happens internally too.
Mm.
And then we're doing it for ourselves.
Yeah, the image that came up is like a mother who's trying to instill in her daughter a healthy
Mhm.
self-image, but then the daughter sees the mom
Yeah.
pinching and pulling and criticizing her own
Yeah.
body. It's
Yeah.
it's that's exactly right, that we have to lead by example. And I love I had to write this down because it made me giggle a little bit when you just said that proving your self-worth is not a thing.
Mhm.
Like, which is so true. It's a story that we've told ourselves that
Mhm.
proving our worth is a thing, but it
Because
can't
who are
if
we proving it to? Like
right. And the proof is that it's there.
Yeah, that's it. It just exists, whether you receive that or not.
Right? Whether
Yeah,
you
yeah,
acknowledge it or not, or whether I acknowledge it or not, it's still
yeah,
there. Our
yeah.
worthiness is still there. It's always intact. And
Yep.
it's never that's not a part of ourselves that needs to be healed, because
No.
that is our wholeness. Really, I think really what so much of healing really is just remembering. It's just, it's unlayering all of the stories that
Mhm,
we've gotten from all the places to just get down to the capital R real story,
mhm,
the truth of our
mhm.
worthiness.
Yeah,
Mm.
I love that.
This was such a lovely conversation, and
Yeah,
I think that so many people are going to come away from this feeling that sense of empowerment to be able to just
I hope
craft the
so.
life that they really want.
Mhm. And one micro step, micro moment
Yeah.
at a time. And it's not linear. It's gonna be super messy, but you get to keep returning back to you.
Mm. Get to keep returning back to you. I love that. Well,
Yeah.
for everyone that's listening, before we go, P.S. we expire?